The deaths of the fighting forces in two world wars were only part of the total casualties. Genocide, ethnic violence, and other atrocities took place as extremist groups rose to power. During and after World War I, the Ottoman Empire, ruled by a clique of young Turks, were disturbed by the continuing decline of Ottoman power, perpetrated the Armenian genocide in which some 1.5 million Armenians died. As Adolf Hitler implemented the Holocaust, he referred to the Armenian annihilation as a reminder of how little the Nazis need fear for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. He said at the time, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Ethnic atrocities did not end after World War II. Dictator Pol Pot wanted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines, resulting in the deaths of 1.6 to 1.8 million Cambodians. And in Rwanda, the majority Hutu government directed mass slaughter of the Tutsi minority. After 3 years of a bloody stalemate, the United States entered World War I in 1917, despite considerable popular protests in the United States against American involvement. By the summer of 1918, when U.S. forces were in place in Europe, U.S. actions helped push the war in Allies' favor. Allied advances against the Central Power forced Germany to surrender on November 11, 1918, which became known as Armistice Day. Between 8 million and 9 million soldiers died in the war, with more than 21 million wounded. In France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, fewer than half of all young men who fought for their countries returned physically unharmed. Soldiers who did return often bore emotional scars. Civilian casualties were harder to record, but estimates range anywhere from 6 million to 13 million. This was one of the first modern wars where civilians were considered legitimate targets. Although the Allies' propaganda often exaggerated accounts of atrocities, reports of German soldiers raping women and killing families during their march through Belgium were common. The most shocking example of such atrocities were the deaths of between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians in Turkey. This action has been called the 20th century's first genocide, the attempted killing of a group of people based on their race, religion, or ethnicity. The Ottoman government alleged that the Christian Armenians, a minority within the Ottoman Empire, were cooperating with the Russian army, an Ottoman enemy during World War I. As punishment for this cooperation, the Ottoman government deported Armenians from their homes between 1915 and 1917 and into camps in Syria and what is today Iraq. Many Armenians died from starvation, disease, or exposure to the elements. Turkish troops executed others. Armenians have argued that the deaths were genocide. The Turkish government has said that the deaths were a result of actions of war, ethnic conflicts, and disease, not genocide. War-related deaths continued past Armistice Day in the form of an influenza epidemic. Under peacetime circumstances, a disease might devastate a concentrated group of people in a particular region. However, in 1918, millions of soldiers were returning home as the war ended. As they did, they had contact with loved ones and friends, thereby spreading the flu. In 1919, the epidemic became a pandemic, a disease prevalent over a large area or the entire world, killing 20 million people in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. India alone may have lost 7 million people to the disease. The worldwide spread of the disease was another sign that while nationalism remained a powerful political force, improvements in transportation were creating a global culture that would create global challenges. Whether people could create effective international responses was unclear. A more intangible casualty of the war was the loss of a sense of security and hopefulness. The term lost generation, first used to describe American expatriate writers living in Paris after the war, came to be used more broadly to describe those suffering from the shock of the war. World War I was the bloodiest war thus far in history. It resulted in tremendous suffering and death for both military personnel and civilians. In the Soviet Union, peasants strongly resisted Stalin's collectivization of agriculture. They hid or destroyed their crops and killed their livestock rather than turning them over to state control. This led to famines from human action rather than by weather or crop failures. The famines in 1932 and 1933 were especially devastating in the Ukraine, one of the Soviet Union's most fertile farming regions. An estimated 7 million to 10 million peasants died as a result of these famines. The government took much of the crops that were grown to feed industrial workers or to use for industry. Although peasants starved, industry grew. Because of the widespread fighting, advances in technology of destruction, and its impact on the economies and civilian life of so many nations, the effects of World War II were unprecedented. Although exact casualty figures have been impossible to determine, total deaths probably numbered 40 million to 50 million. Maybe half of those were citizens of the Soviet Union, and millions of others were from Germany, Poland, China, and Japan. Losses among the U.S. troops were fewer, but still considerable. About 290,000 soldiers were killed and more than 600,000 wounded. Civilian casualties from attacks on land, air, and sea, from government execution based on political rationales, including genocide, and from disease and starvation caused by the war, likely exceeded military casualties. During the war, the world gradually learned about Nazi brutality. In its pursuit of territory, Germany forcibly removed many Slavic people, including 1 million Poles and Roma, also known as Gypsies, from their homes. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the Nazi Special Police, or SS, oversaw these policies. In addition, more than 7 million residents of conquered territories were forced to work in labor camps or in jobs that supported the German war effort. The Nazis sent political opponents, people with disabilities, and gay people to the camps. But the largest single group the Nazis targeted were the Jewish people. When Hitler became chancellor, he instituted many policies that reflected those extreme anti-Semitic views, such as the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 that banned Jews from certain professions in certain schools. Jewish people were forced to live in sections of cities called ghettos. In 1942, the Nazi persecution of Jews turned into mass murder. They began a campaign led by the SS to kill all Jews in Europe, a plan they called the Final Solution. Initially, Nazi killing units moved from place to place, shooting Jews and burying them in mass graves. Later, the SS began rounding up Jews and shipping them to death camps, where Nazis gassed them. Auschwitz and Treblinka in Poland and Dachau in Germany were some of the largest camps. By the end of the war, the Nazis had killed about 6 million Jews, an act of genocide known as the Holocaust. The Nazis killed another 5 million people who belonged to other persecuted groups or were Soviet prisoners of war. The Nazis worked many to death in labor camps and massacred others. During the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, Japanese soldiers killed at least 100,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians in what was called the Rape of Nanking. During World War II, although the Japanese did not carry out a dedicated policy of genocide that paralleled the Holocaust, millions of people died as a result of their policies. Under the program Asian for Asiatics, Japan forced people they had conquered into labor programs. These included service in the military, on public works projects, and on farms to reduce the food shortage in Japan. The Japanese army forced women in Korea, China, and other occupied countries to become comfort women or prostitutes for Japanese soldiers. Because of these harsh programs, more than 1 million civilians died in Vietnam alone. Perhaps an equal number of Allied prisoners of war and local workers perished while doing forced labor for Japan. Air warfare carried out by the United States and the other Allies brought a new type of deadly combat to civilians. The Allies' firebombing of German cities, particularly Hamburg in 1943 and Dresden in 1945, caused large casualties. The numbers of deaths in Hamburg was about 50,000. Dresden had fewer casualties, maybe 25,000 deaths, as 15 square miles of its historic city center were destroyed. The United States also firebombed Tokyo. The final two air attacks in the war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, produced not only high casualties, but tremendous fear about the destructiveness of future war fought with nuclear weapons. These weapons had been developed by an international group of scientists working in the United States. The scientific achievement was impressive, but it also required developments in other areas to have military use. For example, to deliver the nuclear weapons required improvements in airplane design to allow long flights carrying heavy loads. There is a great difference between the planes used in World War II and those used in World War I. In addition, the widespread use of aircraft carrier by several powers extended the airplane's reach. Using these developments in planes and ships, countries could carry out air attacks anywhere in the world. The global community said never again to genocide after the horrors of the Holocaust. However, genocide continued to occur. Ethnic conflict drove the genocide in Bosnia. The end of World War I brought with it the creation of several new nations in Eastern Europe, including Yugoslavia. The country was home to Serbians, who were Eastern Orthodox Christians, Croats and Slavons, who were Catholic, and Muslims in the regions of Bosnia and Kosovo. Marshal Joseph Tito led communist Yugoslavia from the end of World War II until his death in 1980. As dictator, Tito tried to suppress separatist tendencies among the people of Yugoslavia by keeping Serbia and Croatia, the two largest republics, from dominating the smaller ones. After the Soviet Union collapsed, so did Yugoslavia. When Slovenia, Croatia, and Montenegro declared independence, they each defined citizenship in terms of ethnic background and religion. Serbian nationalists led by the demigod Milosevic were particularly emphatic about ethnic purity. Serb forces, in attempts to dominate states such as Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, committed horrific acts of ethnic cleansing against Muslims from Bosnia and Kosovo, killing or driving people who were not part of the main ethnic group from their homes. Bosnians, Kosovos, and Croats fought back, causing more casualties. Serb soldiers raped untold numbers of Muslim women. In total, more than 300,000 people in the region perished over the course of the Yugoslavia's Balkanization or disintegration into separate states. One of the smallest countries in Africa, Rwanda, was the site of one of the worst genocides in modern history. Ethnic and tribal hatred going back to the colonial era was behind the slaughter. Belgian colonizers had treated the minority Tutsis better than the majority Hutus. The latter group resented all the power that the Tutsis enjoyed. When Rwanda won independence from Belgium in 1962, the Hutu majority easily won control of the government and took revenge on the Tutsis by discriminating against them. In response, tens of thousands of Tutsis fled the country and formed a rebel army. In 1993, Tutsi and Hutu forces in Rwanda began negotiations for a coalition government in which both ethnic groups would share power. The negotiations were cut short in 1994 when Rwanda's president, a Hutu, was killed in an airplane crash, supposedly shot down by rebel forces. This incident lit the flames of genocide. Over the next 3 months or so, between 500,000 and 1 million civilians, mostly Tutsis and some moderate Hutus, were killed. Some sources estimate that casualties were even higher. International responses ranged from insufficient to callous. United Nations peacekeepers were instructed not to use force to restore order. There were also too few peacekeepers to protect all Rwandans. Individual countries, including the United States, evacuated their personnel from the country after Belgian peacekeepers were killed. UN peacekeepers and individual nations failed to evacuate any Rwandans. The Rwandan genocide focused attention on the lack of leadership in the international community. It became clear that the United Nations needed to think seriously about its role in violent conflicts if it wanted to effectively protect human lives and human rights. Another genocide erupted in 2003 in Darfur, a region located in western Sudan. Most of the people involved were Muslim, but some were nomadic pastoralists of Arab descent, while others were non-Arab farmers. The government of Sudan was controlled by Arab Muslims. Two Darfur rebel groups composed of non-Arabs took up arms against the Sudanese government in response to attacks from nomads. In response, the government unleashed Arab militants known as Janjaweed, or evil men on horseback, on the region. Together with Sudanese forces, the Janjaweed attacked and destroyed hundreds of villages throughout Darfur, slaughtering more than 200,000 people, mostly non-Arab Muslim Africans. More than 1 million people were displaced, creating a refugee crisis that spilled into neighboring Chad. Despite negotiations, appeals, and the International Criminal Court charging Sudan's president, Omar al-Bashir, with war crimes, the genocide continued. The genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Sudan became stains on the conscience of the world. International organizations in the broad global community were supposed to defend human rights after the Jewish Holocaust. Considering the millions of lives lost and human dignity shattered, the failure of the international community appeared obvious.